Thank you very much for that. This is a webinar that's about creating a foundational course in a field that is emerging, sports communication. And before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about me and my background, just as it's related to the course. I've taught this course, sports communication, now for the last 4 semesters. The first time I taught it, it was a special topics course. And I have seen the course morph from a special topics course into an actual course. So I know a little bit about the tribulations of getting a course approved from that perspective, starting it out as special topics and then having it as a regular course. Secondly, for 7 years, I worked as the Associate Dean for Curriculum in the College of Arts, Media, and Design. And in that role, my job, in part, dealt with dealing with faculty who had ideas for courses and then shepherding a course through the approval process, both within the college and throughout the university. So again, I have some experience with getting a new course approved and some of the tribulations that are related to it. Third, as Jenna mentioned, I did write this book called Sports Communication, Dimensions, Theory, Applications, and Culture. It was an experience. It's not my first book, but it was still an educational experience. Those of you who have written, I look at the list of registrants, almost everybody here is most people here are academics, so you know what I'm going to talk about, in that every time you write something, you realize how much you don't know. One door leads to 5 other doors. So my point here is that I really found out that there is a lot to know about sports communication beyond what I initially thought I knew. And that leads me to my last point, and that is, I do hope that during the Q&A session that follows, people will be bringing their comments and questions so that will be enriching for the webinar. That is, the webinar will become a better webinar because of the comments you make at the end. All right, so let's get started. It's a new area of study. Sports communication is a new area of study. About 10 years ago, you wouldn't find many courses in sports communication. I went to the NCAA conference in San Antonio, and I think that was in 2007. There was 1 session on sports communication. Now it's an interest group in sports communication. There's an interest group in sports communication at the National Communication Association. Okay. It's based on the premise that communication issues and sport issues intersect, and that because of communication, there are effects. Teams and leagues succeed because they have effective communication. And sometimes they don't succeed because their communication is weak. Most of you know that Westbrook was just traded from the Oklahoma City Thunder to the Houston Rockets. Well, there's another star on the Houston Rockets. How Harden and Westbrook communicate, that's going to affect the quality of success of the Houston Rockets. So communication, team and league success, sports and communication affect and are affected by what we call the media, both conventional media and the new media. Sports and communications intersections influence the economy. You're familiar with the dialogue, to be polite, between Megan Rapinoe and the White House. And it indicates how sports and communication can affect politics. It can affect international diplomacy. There are family relationships that are affected because of sports and communication. And as we know, educational institutions, because of the broadcasting of football games and basketball games and the revenue brought in, that are dedicated to sports communication. The International Journal of Sports Communication for one, Communication and Sport for another, and many journals carry articles that are in sports communication. So it's an evolving area, not only in terms of it's becoming more common, but we see more of our scholarship that's dealing with sports communication. However, there are challenges for educators regarding this new field. The first, and it's paramount, and that is, how do you define sports communication appropriately and comprehensively? Second, given the definition, how do you design a course or courses in sports communication so that you can address how you've defined sport communication? How do you get approval for these courses, which is not always a simple matter? And you need pedagogical resources. You need people to teach these courses in books. How do you find pedagogical resources for sports communication? The goals for this webinar are really to address these 4 issues: defining sports communication, designing the courses, gaining departmental and university approval, and finding resources. All right, so what are the dimensions of sports communication? If there's one thing that you take away from this webinar, it's that sports communication is broad. It is not a narrowly defined area. Yes, sports communication deals in large part with the relationship between media and sports. The phenomenon of March Madness became a phenomenon because ESPN decided in the early 80s to broadcast all of the games in the first 2 days of the tournament. Now there are 3 days. There's a Tuesday preliminary match. But what happened, March Madness became the event that it is within the United States because of television and exposure. Yes, people will point to the 1979 matchup between Indiana State and Michigan State and say that's when it really started. But it really started in this country because of TV exposure. A few years ago, I mentioned in this country because a few years ago I gave a paper in Ireland about March Madness, and some of the attendees thought I had created the phrase. And in other words, it had not yet gone, and this was only in 2015, beyond our borders to a large extent. Super Bowl Sunday has become something of a national holiday. People gather around the television, even people who are not that interested in football, to watch the Super Bowl. There are dedicated sports stations, the NFL Network, Major League Baseball, NBA Network, that have been created because of the voracious hunger for sports. But it's not just media and sports, and that's an important point that I'd like to bang out today. How coaches and athletes communicate will affect team success. And it's important to examine the interpersonal communication that goes on within a team. There's a book called The Captain's Class that has been recently written where it argues that the captain and how the captain communicates is the singular factor that affects team excellence. I'm not sure I agree with it, but I do agree that coach and athlete communication is important. Sports organizations experience crises. You might have an athlete on your college team who committed a crime, stole some food from a convenience store. How do you react to that crisis? You might have an athlete who is exposed as someone who took drugs. How do you communicate regarding that crisis? The new media has had such a dramatic effect on sports that it's almost difficult right now to put your arms around that effect. Sometimes I'll watch a sporting event and it will seem to me that I'll also check my phone at the same time that more people are tweeting about that event than they actually are watching the event. When David Fizdale came to the Knicks, the first thing he said is, we're going to change the culture. Well, what's the relationship between communication and changing team culture? That's another area. That's a dimension of sports communication. Title IX has had a dramatic effect on our universe. The women's success in ice hockey and the recent success in the World Cup, who knows how many of those athletes would have been able to participate in sports had it not been for Title IX and the discourse, the communication around Title IX. Athletes now use their platform to speak about social issues. Whether they should or not is a matter for debate. I'm sure you heard about the newscaster who urged LeBron James to shut up and dribble. Many athletes do not want to just shut up and dribble. And this is an issue that's within sports communication. Should athletes and how do athletes communicate about social issues, and should they use their platform to do so? How do teams nourish fan support? How do you communicate in order to nourish that support? That's a dimension of sports communication. There are books, films, the 30 for 30 series, nonfiction about sports that seem to proliferate. This also is an area of sports communication examination. Any area of study has ethical dimensions. I mentioned earlier the scenario where an athlete has stolen goods, and let's say this athlete is your main stud. Do you communicate that you're going to suspend this athlete? Or do you suggest that perhaps all the data is not in so that athlete can continue to play? Should coaches berate officials in the hope that calls will go their way? So ethics in sports communication is a dimension of sports communication study. Post-game news conferences. Athletes are interviewed as soon as the game is over. Coaches have news conferences. How does that affect perspective of the teams, the leagues, and the athletes themselves? International politics has been affected by sports communication. Satellite communication has allowed for sports that at one point were not that known outside of one country to be known in another country. I think it's very important within sports communication to discuss theory and how theories are related to sports communication. Take this second sub-bullet here. There's a craze now with sports analytics. How much different is sports analytics than Taylor's one best way in scientific management, studying the one best way to do something and then doing it that way? Isn't that very similar to what analytics is? So I think that it's important to discuss and describe theory and how that applies to sports communication. Okay. I have a colleague who's written about what happens when a parent has a child and the child does not root for the same team the parent roots for. And I think it's important to examine family and interpersonal relationships within family in terms of sports fandom. I have a relatives where the husband roots for the Steelers and the wife roots for the Patriots. And while there's some good-natured ribbing, sometimes the ribbing isn't so good-natured. So that there can be tension and issues related to sports communication and family relationships. Okay, why is it important to have a comprehensive perspective when you're teaching a course called sports communication? Here's why. Here's why I think it's important. If you have a narrow definition, then you have a narrow conception of the field. If all you do is define sports communication as media and communication, then that's what it's going to be about. In the early days of sports communication, most of the articles were related to media, but it's a narrow conception, and therefore you will create a field that is too parochial if you have a narrow definition of the field. You're going to ignore important areas of examination, like ethical issues, influences, crisis communication, communication and team culture. These circles that are on the right-hand side of the screen represent different areas of sports communication study. You're going to limit the interest of some audiences. People who are not interested in broadcasting might not study sports communication if all sports communication is the study of broadcasting. So I think it's important to just as possible. And lastly, as it relates to this course, you're undermining the goal of foundational courses. And that goal is to be able to answer the question at the end of the course, what is sports communication? When students complete my course, they ought to be able to answer the question, what is sports communication? And I put down here, think Alex. I have a cousin named Alex. And when I first started writing the book, I was at a Thanksgiving gathering. And Alex, who's a college graduate, interested in sports, asked me what I was up to. I said, I'm writing a book about sports communication. And his eyes lit up and he said, that's great. And then he said, what is it? And I think that while I was writing the book and I came to a section where I was having trouble expressing exactly what I wanted to say, I thought, think Alex. That is, your goal is to try to explain what this is to an intelligent, hungry audience. All right. I think it's also interesting, at least, to look at how pervasive sports communication is in everyday conversation. People not related to sports will say that meeting was a game changer. At the interview, she knocked it out of the park. We've got them on the ropes. It's no longer a level playing field. They struck out with that idea. We had a great idea, but the administrators dropped the ball. I have a friend who wouldn't be able to tell you the difference between a basketball and a cantaloupe. She is not at all interested in sports, but one day we were talking about a proposal that she had, and she said, but, I had a great idea, but the administrators dropped the ball. So even for people who are not interested in sports, we use sports metaphors. Do you have any sort of game plan? We heard this a lot recently. The special prosecutor was on a fishing expedition. All right, so let's get to the point. So I've discussed the necessity for having a broad perspective on what sports communication is. Let's talk a little bit about the problems with getting this course approved. First, it's a new field. Anytime there's a new field, there are cynics who wonder about whether or not the new field has legitimacy. When I first started teaching organizational communication, it was new. And people wondered what I did in the course called organizational communication. Even back in the 60s, when sociology surfaced, there were people who looked cynically about this new field. As I said, conservative audiences can question new fields. Another problem is that the course can seem to be easy and seem to be one that attracts students that are seeking an undemanding class. I mean, what do they do in that class? They just schmooze about sports. And that's a problem in getting courses approved. You want to make sure the course is substantive. And you need faculty and text resources. The idea that you can get Coach Jones to come in and talk about her or his experience with pep talks is not enough. You've got to get faculty, and you've got to have textbooks or books that can be resources that will help instructors. Well, the text resources will help instructors teach the course, and the faculty will be able to teach a comprehensive class. You can address these challenges. It's a new field challenge. I think it's important to point out that it's a good thing to be in the vanguard when you're competing for quality students. That is, you want to be one of those people, one of those schools where you're ahead of the game. And by teaching a course that's new or offering a program that's new, you're in the vanguard. Secondly, administrators are very receptive to courses that populate. My experience at Northeastern is that we have always populated the course in the fall. We're offering 2 sections, 30 students in it, that the course is closed out so quickly that freshmen and sophomores have been unable to enroll. Now, the course has gotten, I'll mention this in a little bit, but it's gotten some street cred as being a good course and a substantive course. And therefore, the students who enroll in it know what they're getting into. And you can argue that a course that is substantive, that can pack in the classes, it's very attractive to those who make decisions about new classes. Again, I think the key is that it has to be a substantive class. Okay, all new fields can be questioned by conservative audiences. One thing that's important to do is to point out that there's research in this area. The International Journal of Sport Communication and Communication in Sport is dedicated to issues about sports communication. In the last chapter of my book, I talk about other journals that regularly publish articles in sport communication. I can remember back when even the field of communication studies was not one that conservative audiences were likely to think was a good one. We showed cynics the journals, and the journals were often enough to convince people that the field had legitimacy. I think if you define the field comprehensively and clearly, then you have a good chance to gain and wow, if not wow, gain conservative audiences. It can seem easy, all right? Well, it's very important to provide a syllabus that reflects rigor, and actually having a course that's rigorous, that exams are rigorous, and that you can show people who might think otherwise that people are not just talking about ESPN in this course. It requires faculty and pedagogical resources. Well, you have to assign faculty who, even if they're not that knowledgeable, are committed to becoming knowledgeable and are committed to seeing the field as something that is substantive and comprehensive. All right, in terms of course content, how do you convince people that the course, or how do you make the course substantive? Let me just tell you what I've done. Each class begins with a daily prompt. Students are required to submit on Blackboard the night before a one-page paper that responds to a daily prompt. For example, player-only meetings are valuable for team cohesion and performance. A coach's pep talk can affect team performance. Sports writers have a moral obligation to disclose reprehensible athlete behavior, even if the behavior has no effect on game performance. So the night before, each student will have to write a one-page paper that presents their position on this subject. And then when you begin the class with a discussion, well, by doing this, the students are not speaking off the top of their head when they come to class. And what's more, the course gets a reputation of one that has some substance. I often lose students in the first week who say, what, I've got to do something in this class? I thought I was going to be able to talk about the Eckersley feud off the top of my head. Well, by doing this, it's not a terribly arduous assignment, but it's an assignment. ESPN's body issue is demeaning to women as well as men. Interestingly, when I do this one, most of the students will think that the ESPN's body issue is not demeaning to women, but the Sports Illustrated is demeaning to women. I mean, it goes back, and it's not always along gender lines. That's an aside. LeBron James should shut up and dribble. The documentary Murder Ball has had a positive effect on attitudes towards physically challenged athletes. All right, so what we do is we begin the course with this paper that students can discuss that they've already worked on. I make sure to include relevant theory. When I'm talking about sports communication, students have to learn what image repair theory is. When I talk about establishing team culture, I talk about human resources theory and how human resources theory evolved. Very big thing in my course is you're talking about league communication. Well, let's apply systems theory. You may remember last year when the National Football League decided that they were going to put forth a new policy that was related to the national anthem. Well, they put that through policy they announced that policy as a compromise. What they didn't do was inform the National Football League Players Association about the compromise. And that created a risk. So I think if you present the principles of systems theory, you address this. And I think you have, again, to make the course content substantive, you deal with all issues, not just media. You make sure your exams are rigorous. I have a combination of short answer exam as well as a take-home final. It says take-home essay, but a take-home final and reaction papers during the course. Okay, text resources. Look, I am biased. I wrote a book myself. So it's difficult to be dispassionate about a book that you wrote yourself. There are other books besides mine. Kendall Hunt, my publisher, has another book called Sports Communication and Interpersonal Approach. It does take a narrow approach to sports communication, but it's an option. Communication Sport Surveying the Field by Billings and others. That book is in its third or so edition, and it is an introductory book in sports communication. Strategic Sport Communication is a compendium of a lot of information that's related to sport communication. Okay, again, it's tough to be dispassionate about a book you wrote yourself. But I think the book that I wrote addresses the issues that I have talked about, and there are features in it that are instructor-friendly and student-friendly. For example, each chapter has exercises. One of them is fair or foul. So I present a case like the street outside Fenway Park, Yorkie Way, should have been renamed or should not have been renamed. And then students have to respond, or they can respond, to whether or not they think that renaming the street was fair or foul. And each chapter has one of these fair or foul questions in it. Each chapter, once I present some relevant theory, has a test yourself. Now, I'm not talking about end of chapter questions, and there are those too, but there's a test yourself. And I think it helps the instructor to be able to use this as a resource to generate discussion. I mentioned the sports communication prompts. Every chapter starts with 4 or 5. There are 9 chapters, so that's about 45 of these prompts that appear in the book. I present a chapter in a nutshell summary, which I attempted to at least frame the chapter by really nutshelling what was in it and giving the students, a frame to understand what's happening next. Again, I think it also helps the instructor. You'll see on the right-hand side that there's something called practitioner perspectives. Each chapter includes an interview that I conducted with someone who's a practitioner, not an academic, but someone who's a practitioner. For example, Kendall Coyne, who is now the captain of the United States Olympic team. I interviewed her, and she talked about the importance of communication for team success. Peter Roby, who's now a member of the Knight Commission, I interviewed him about his role. He was the athletic director at Northeastern University, and how important communication was for his success. Peter also was one of the people who decided which teams got to make the March Madness tournament. So we talked about communication in that regard as well. The head of digital and social media for AS Roma is Paul Rogers, and he talked about his strategy for nourishing fandoms and creating fandom with social media. So every chapter has one of these practitioner perspectives. I didn't mention another one is Hillary Witt, who's the head coach at the University of New Hampshire. All right. Each chapter concludes, I think they're always in the conclusion, but maybe there's some that are interspersed with first-person narratives. These are non-academic opinion pieces about issues. For example, what is a fan? Whether or not, now this might sound academic, but whether or not catharsis theory is more relevant than stimulation theory. And it's an opinion piece, and I think they're easy to read, and they're something that can create discussion in the class. The content is comprehensive. There are chapters in crisis, fandom, sports communication, and I didn't list them all here, but the table of contents is available. Let's see. I think the table of contents is available if you go to the website for the book, and you'll see that the book is comprehensive. I wrote it's at the end of the PP program, but it's actually, I was told when we did a rehearsal for this that it's going to be in the table of contents, that it's going to be on the website. And I think the text is accessible. If you read it, it's easy to read while still being substantive, and it answers the question that Alex asked me: what is sports communication? Again, there are other books out there. I realize I'm biased, but I think this one does the job. Okay, so in summary, it's an evolving discipline. There are obstacles, but those obstacles can be addressed. The course content must be multifaceted and include all areas. The pedagogy should include interactive discussions. I think it's essential that your assignments are challenging to make sure that the dilettantes, people who are just in there because they thought it was easy, don't take the course. You should use a comprehensive text, and you should have exams that are not only essays, but as well as short answers so people are aware of the facts. I think it's essential that the pedagogy ought to include theory to make the course as substantive as it needs to be. There are resources available, as I mentioned, and now I will stop and be glad to take questions from anybody, and I appreciate your participation, and I also thank you for spending 30 or so minutes with this webinar. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Alan. We have a couple questions that have came in already.
Okay.
So the first one, what are some of the institutional components and outcomes that this course fulfills?
Okay. Well, I think at different schools, it'll be different things. At our school, we have a number of core requirements, and one core requirement is to take a course that's related to ethics. This course, because there's a heavy emphasis on ethics, satisfies that. This course also satisfies the difference and diversity requirement in our program. So I think it depends upon the institution. But in our school, it addresses those two areas. I mean, it satisfies a student's need. Student has to take a course in certain areas. It satisfies the ethics requirement, and it satisfies the difference and diversity requirement.
Great. So another question we have is, what kind of student feedback have you gotten?
Well, it's interesting. The first week or so, when the course first started, you'd have people who dropped the course in the first week because they thought that it was going to be, well, easy. But what's happened is the course has gotten street credibility, and the feedback has been very, well, it feels good, very comforting. Students like the course. They may grouse about the paper that they have to write, but they in fact do write these papers, and afterwards they tell me they enjoyed the discussion, and they even enjoyed having to submit a paper every day. I think the feedback that is most conclusive is that it's becoming very difficult to get into the class. We got 60 students in, and the course closed so fast that freshmen and sophomores aren't in it.
Well, that's great. So another question we have is, how would you integrate the use of films in the course? It could be mainstream films or documentaries.
I have. What has happened is I have required students to watch a number of films. One, and then what I'd have the students do, one of the daily prompt would relate to the film. For example, students have to watch the film Murder Ball. And then the daily prompt is related to whether or not Murder Ball actually has a positive effect on attitudes towards handicapped athletes. Students will have to watch I think it's called Big Lies. I'm not really saying the title correctly. It's the 30 by 30 that talks about the rape scandal at Duke University. I think it's called Fantastic Lies, and then comment about that. So I think there are 5 documentaries that students have to watch outside of class that relate to the daily prompt that they're going to have to write. So I do integrate films and videos. I have a list of the ones that I have used, but I change them periodically. But they definitely are used.
Well, that's awesome.
I think so.
Also regarding the course, how would you integrate guest speakers such as players or coaches?
Well, that's a challenge. I have done that. And here's what the challenge is, that, for example, we had the hockey coach come speak to our class, and he really was terrific. He came very well prepared and spoke about the challenges he had of communicating both to his athletes and also to the athletic director. By the way, was sitting in the room while he was making his presentation. We've also I had the fellow Paul Rogers, who I mentioned, who is the head of digital media at AS Roma. He came to speak, and because of his familiarity with social media. We had a fellow who's a scholar, the Ilan Tarmir, came and spoke about really crazy fans and fans who are destructive and fight and what that's about. So I say it's a challenge. It's a scheduling challenge at times. Just from a logistical point of view, my classes in the fall, one meets on Monday and Wednesday, and one meets on Monday and Thursday. So if I get the hockey coach, will he be willing to talk to two classes? And would he be willing to come on a Wednesday and then a Thursday? But we have certainly had people come to speak. We had the 1 year, and this was a real challenge, we had the person who is in charge of communication for our athletic department come to speak. But the guy is so busy that it was very difficult to find a day when he wasn't out talking about the women's ice hockey team or the men's ice hockey team or the invitation we got to go to March Madness last year. So it was difficult, but we do it. We do use it, and the students like it. I hope that's not a comment on whether they like me or not, but they certainly do like when other faculty members come, not faculty members actually, practitioners come to speak to the class.
So what about Skyping or video chatting with the guest speaker?
We haven't used that, but it's an idea. We have not used that. We could. I guess I'd be again concerned with some logistical issues, but there's nothing to say that should not be used. I'd rather have someone come in person, but it's an option, and it just hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so we have another question. My focus of teaching is journalism, but many teams are crafting their own news sites to connect with fans. Any ideas for a course on how to teach communications for a team while still holding true to good journalism?
Well, I think the question brings up a number of points. By the way, at Northeastern, we have a separate course called sports writing in the journalism department. They're complementary. We encourage students to take courses in both areas. In fact, we now have a sports communication minor where you have to take a course in both areas. I think that the issue with being a journalist in the new world of social media and being a journalist in a world where you're competing with corporate communicators from leagues is a challenge. Let's take one at a time. I think the gatekeeping function in traditional journalism is, it's not undermined, but it is challenged when you have people who can communicate immediately without any gatekeeper checking the facts. So it's a challenge. I think it's important to juxtapose journalists with people who are working for a team. The corporate communicator the New England Patriots puts out a magazine, and there is a difference between that magazine and the coverage in the Boston Globe. So I do think a way to do it would be to juxtapose, okay, this is what the corporate communicators say, which doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but what they're saying, with this is how a journalist would cover it.
Great. So another question we have now is, what skills do employers say recent grads are lacking?
Typically, we're a cooperative education school, which means our students go out to work while school is in session. That is, you study for 6 months and then you go out on co-op or work in co-op. So we get quite a bit of feedback on this. Typically, people talk about speaking skills, reading skills, listening skills. These three skills are often identified as problematic. Writing skills to some extent as well. I think if you were going to coach, and this is a question actually that was posed earlier when we first sent out things to potential participants, if you were going to coach a student about how to prepare for the world subsequently for a job, you'd want to say, make sure your skills are good. And I would say in that regard, it's the speaking, reading, listening, writing, and also your technological skills in the contemporary our contemporary times. I think you would also want to say, hey, what you have to do is learn about sports communication comprehensively, because you become more valuable to an organization the better you can conceptualize what sports communication entails. Knowing how to write will not preclude the problem that the NFL had when they wrote a new policy but didn't communicate with the NFLPA about that policy. So I think it's understanding the breadth and having have pursued a curriculum where you study the breadth of sports communication is important. Third, I think it's important to get involved in extracurricular or co-curricular activities while you're there at the school. And fourth, develop a portfolio. As you go through your university time, develop a portfolio of the various things that you've submitted. If you took my class and you wrote a terrific reaction paper to one of the prompts, put that in your portfolio. And so I think those four things is how I would tell a student to prepare. This is a broader answer than the question that you asked, but skill sets that are needed are speaking, listening, reading, and writing, as well as technological skills. And then I think a good student to prepare is to know the area, follow a curriculum that's broad, and then involve yourself in extracurricular or co-curricular activities. And lastly, keep a portfolio or create a portfolio.
So regarding class assignments, are there ways you have used out-of-class assignments and context as extensions of the course, such as interviews with practitioners or engagement with on-campus athletic programs?
The only way, I think that's a fine idea, but the only way I have done it is by asking students who have listened to guest speakers to respond and react to their to what they heard. There are some of my students who already have interacted with the athletic department. I have students who work for the work for the director of communication for the director of communication for our sports department, and some have worked for the Red Sox. One woman was in charge of the Boston Pride's communication. So I've had people who are involved, but the assignments, I haven't told students, okay, what you have to do is you have to interview Paul Rogers. Rather, I've said, okay, Paul Rogers came to our class. What's your reaction to Paul Rogers?
Thanks for elaborating. So now we have a two-part question. One thing that is lacking in many sports communication courses is visible diversity among the students in the class. In other words, most students are white and male, which directly mirrors the sports industry at large. My two questions are, how do you engage students holding privileged identities on social issues that they may feel like are not relevant to them?
Well, I haven't had that issue. Maybe it's because we are in Boston, and maybe because we have a very diverse population. In my sports communication class, there is gender and racial diversity and international diversity. One of the things that some of my students ask for, particularly those who are not from the United States, is more information about cricket or soccer. So I think I haven't experienced that firsthand. I do think that if I was experiencing that, if I did have a homogeneous population and their comments were reflecting this privileged position, I would challenge them. I would take the position of those who were not privileged. Let's take, for example, the issue of whether or not athletes should use their platform. If you had a very conservative audience and the students came out universally saying, no, students, in fact, athletes should not use their platform. They should shut up and dribble. That's not, I haven't experienced that. But if I did, I would just take the other position and said, here's the other position. And for example, before my book was published, I used other books that were related to sports communication in lieu of a textbook. And I had people read We Matter, which is a book that former basketball player wrote about the importance of speaking out. $40 Million Slaves was on that list. Playing Hurt by John Saunders was on that list. So I think if I was faced with a situation where I had a homogeneous audience and that audience presented they were coming from a privileged position that did not acknowledge diversity, I would challenge it. And I would certainly challenge it by pointing out that if you look at our athletes throughout in various sports, you have diversity. And so that's the way I would handle it. Actually, what I've done sometimes is I've assigned something and I've required a tandem to take opposing positions. That even if you had a position that was position X, somebody in that tandem had to present position Y, just to make sure we brought out both sides of an issue.
Well, thank you for clarifying, Alan. That's about all the time we have for today. Thank you everyone for joining us. In the next days, you'll be getting a recording of the webinar, and also we'll have Alan's email address attached on there so you can reach out to him with any additional questions you may have. All right, thank you, Alan.